Democracy That Delivers is brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. Now, to your host.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Democracy That Delivers podcast. I'm Jenny Anderson, a program director for Asia and the Pacific here at the Center for International Private Enterprise. Today, we'll be discussing the global rise of autocratic regimes and how to defeat dictators with Charles Dunst, the author of a new book entitled Defeating the Dictators, How Democracy Can Prevail in the Age of the Strong Man. Charles is also an associate at the Asia Group and a fellow at CSIS. He is a former foreign correspondent reporting from Cambodia, Vietnam, and Burma for the New York Times and the Atlantic. He's also written numerous opinion pieces for these outlets, as well as for the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, CNN, among many, many others. And for our listeners, you will remember Charles from two fairly recent episodes where we discussed Cambodia's transition to an authoritarian regime and what we could expect as Cambodia chaired the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. Charles, a very warm welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for joining us, and congratulations on your book.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be back.
Great. So to begin, perhaps could you walk our listeners through what's happened to democracy since the 1990s, and why are citizens in democratic countries around the world increasingly disillusioned with democracy?
Sure. Well, the broad crux of my argument, I don't think I'm the first one to say it, is essentially that democracy has declined since the 1990s because following the end of the Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, I think there was this sense, particularly in the West, that, well, we had won. So we kind of got, for lack of a better phrase, a little lazy, I think, when it comes to things like infrastructure investment or human capital investment or healthcare or money in politics, kind of all these things that serve to weaken, when performance is bad, serve to weaken public trust in government. And basically, I think we were just too optimistic and kind of let things lag. And the broad crux of my argument is when systems don't work so well, when you feel like your healthcare is not working, if you feel like your government's not building new infrastructure, if basic things aren't being delivered, there is more openness to what I've called the autocratic impulse, to the notion that, well, this democratic system isn't working, so I'd be open to some type of strong man, to some type of authoritarian leader that might come in and wave their magic wand and fix everything and build new infrastructure, tackle all the problems. And people's model for that, I think, is the Singapores of the world, the UAEs of the world, but to some extent China, where people think, oh my God, look at how fast they build bridges and roads, and look at how lovely Dubai is and all that. So that's really the crux of my argument. I think basically the system hasn't worked so well, frankly, in a lot of Western and even non-Western countries. So I think about Northeast Asia as well, where distrust in government is at all-time highs in the United States, much of Western Europe. Distrust in government looks different in South Korea and Japan than it does in the West. I think the West, it's generally angrier, but there is still, I think it's something like 30 or 40% of Japanese and Koreans say they are optimistic about the future and they trust their governments. I think that's really what it comes down to, is if you actually look at polling, Americans, Brits, Germans, Japanese, Koreans are not convinced that their children will have better lives than they did. They're not convinced that their children will be better off. And that, to me, is a fairly profound failure of democracy, and explains to me why you do have fairly significant swaths of the populations in Europe, in the United States, not so much in Northeast Asia, kind of open to some type of illiberal leader that comes in and maybe does away with some of those liberal institutions, kind of following the Viktor Orban model in Hungary. Other examples are Bolsonaro, of course, in Brazil. So that's really how I would think about the challenge at hand.
Thank you. And thinking sort of broader about challenges out there, why are China and other economically strong autocracies perhaps even more worrisome challengers to the West than even the former Soviet Union ever was?
Sure. It's actually really the kind of big here at the center of the book, where basically the Soviet Union didn't have an economic system that ever worked. So no one went to Moscow. No one showed up in Moscow from Paris or from London or from New York and came back home and said, wow, the Soviet Union was great. We should be like that. No one did that. Whereas, for example, I was recently in London, doing 10 days of book events related to the book, and I had about 100 people in an audience, and I said, well, mostly, honestly, these Tory MPs, some Labour MPs, mostly MP staffers, young folks. And I asked them, well, how many of you have been to Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Singapore, maybe Shenzhen or Shanghai? Half the crowd raises their hand, 50%. And I said, well, how many of you thought those cities work better than where you live now, whether that's London, Paris, or Washington? And the same 50% raised their hand. And recently I was also doing a South African radio show, and the host says, well, I'm going to do a quick poll. And it says, how many of my listeners would be okay with giving up some of their quote unquote democratic freedoms to live in a country that works? And 98% of those who called in said they would. So that is really the problem, where 25, 30 years ago, no one wanted to be an autocracy because they thought autocracy might actually deliver better. You wanted to be an autocracy because you wanted the small minority of people who wanted to be an autocracy wanted to be an autocracy to kind of vanquish their political opponents. I mean, it was the very aggressive, kind of deeply illiberal political movements that were always kind of on the fringe of the West. But now there is more of a popular sentiment, I think, that we should become like Singapore, we should become like the UAE, not to constrain political opposition necessarily, but just to make sure that things work, to build infrastructure and all that. So that really is a very profound challenge, a very different one. I mean, what helps us is I think it's a mirage. I mean, the notion that authoritarianism works better than democracy is wrong, and it's the whole point of the book. But at some point, perception is reality for people, and I think it is 20% of Americans explicitly say they are open to a strong man. In Europe, polling's a little bit harder to come by. But what's really interesting about Europe is, in the U.S., I think the challenge is mostly from the right. In Europe, the challenge is actually not mostly, but it's also from the left, where there's this notion of quote unquote climate change being bigger than democracy. Is this notion that a few kind of very influential French scholars, I believe, have posited. And that's a very different argument that's basically saying, well, if we had a strong man, he could just wave a magic wand and make the problem with climate change go away, which is, again, not true, but it's a different challenge than what it used to be, I think.
Definitely. If only we could have magic wands to wish these things away. Thinking of the challenges, your book offers an interesting roadmap of 8 principles of good governance that democracies need to embrace to really prevail and overcome the perception. Can you walk us through some of your key principles that you've laid out?
Sure. I mean, the book opens with the notion of meritocracy, which I know has kind of become somewhat controversial in the last few years, but I argue that the most functional countries historically and will be the ones that are the most meritocratic, particularly in terms of government staffing, the ones that are most likely to staff their governments in a fair way and basically hiring the most talented people, attracting the most talented people, rather than necessarily handing out jobs to family friends or the kids who went to school with your children or whatever. So I opened up with meritocracy. I looked then at accountability, the notion that democracies don't really, I think, hold themselves super accountable at the moment, particularly when things go wrong, when bad decisions are made and bad policy is made. People don't usually seem to be held accountable for that. And that's, I think, and also when you kind of break rules. I mean, that's kind of the Boris Johnson story in the UK, of course, is he set COVID rules and then broke the COVID rules and was never punished. I know it's still kind of an ongoing scandal, but that's a little bit of the problem, where I think there is really a sense, definitely in the United States, definitely in the UK, there are 2 sets of rules, that the rules for the rich and rules for everyone else. And I think boosting accountability on all fronts is really key to building trust, which is actually the next chapter, which is basically arguing that trust in government in many ways is the bedrock foundation of much of this, where it's very hard to get the public to buy into infrastructure spending or human capital spending if they just don't trust the government to even deliver. So I wanted to think about ways, how can we actually reestablish trust in government? And I don't want to walk through all 8 because I feel like that might bore people, but the other ones were long-term plans, modernizing our social safety nets, investing more strategically in human capital, building better infrastructure, and that's for both literal roads and digital roads, and thinking about building infrastructure not only when bridges collapse and they need to be repaired, but also thinking about future-focused infrastructure. Well, are we putting things on the cloud? If things are on the cloud, do we have the cybersecurity to actually protect them? Which I think the answer is no. And the last chapter is probably the one on which we've actually gotten the most, not pushback, but interesting kind of media conversations, is I took about immigration. I took about immigration as a benefit, because of the OECD countries, almost none of them post a birth rate that is necessary to maintain a functional demographic balance. And basically, I think the United States, frankly, has already decided that our solution to that is to just continue accepting immigrants. There's a bureaucracy in place that even during the Trump era, when there wasn't necessarily an interest in immigration, immigration numbers were still quite high. I mean, lower than normal, but still quite high compared to much of Europe and certainly compared to Northeast Asia. And basically arguing that the whole point of this chapter is to basically argue that democracies must do better on immigration both for practical and ethical purposes. I mean, there is actually a very clear necessity of immigrants to come in to serve as the tax base to actually pay for elderly people's social assistance for 30 years. And that's kind of bit one, but also the whole argument that immigrants are more innovative. Studies show they are more innovative than native-born citizens, which makes sense to me, where if you're willing to pick up from 5,000 miles away and move to the United States, you are by definition a risk taker. So you are by definition the type of person who might show up in the United States and take the risk to try and innovate a company or to open a store or something along those lines. And that's just the kind of the practical part of immigration. And of course, there are the ethical kind of purposes as well. I mean, my great-grandfather came to the United States from, I guess, what was then Austria-Hungary, what is now Romania. Clearly, there's an ethical reason for immigration as well. But I wanted to basically argue that politicians might, particularly in times of economic downturn, be better served talking about immigration actually in slightly more practical terms of explaining to native-born citizens, well, why does it help you? What is the benefit of bringing in more immigrants? Because I think that's often lost in the conversation sometimes.
Definitely an interesting argument. And also as a person whose all of my grandparents are from other places than the US, definitely it's a great argument. But to go back to a little bit to your importance of trust, in your book, you talk about the mistrust loop. I was wondering if you could touch upon that a moment.
Yeah, I know the mistrust loop is basically this notion that when people do not trust their government, they will not listen to that government, support or even engage that government. And in democracies, that means people won't vote. And that's a real problem because when they don't vote, the government will not provide for them effectively because officials aren't migrators. They can't serve a population from which they have grown distant. So when people don't trust their government and thus opt out of civic participation, the result is the mistrust loop, in which a distrustful public is disengaged, resulting in a government even more disconnected from the public, and the result is an only further deterioration of trust. So I wanted to make sure we stop that before it really takes hold, because I've heard many Americans, Brits, Germans, whatever, say, well, this system isn't working for me. I'm opting out. Politics are so messy. I'm not voting. And that's really dangerous to me because you're going to get more politicians who, frankly, don't represent you. I mean, if you're sitting in your congressional district and 20% of the district votes, clearly that politician, as well-intentioned as they may be on either side of the aisle, is not going to represent what the majority of the district wants or what the majority of the district needs, because they're only really hearing and catering to that 20% that actually vote. So I do think much stronger civic participation could go a fairly long way here in stopping that mistrust loop, because I think without trust, democracy is really at risk, and I think the mistrust loop actually take us down a really dangerous path.
Definitely. I mean, there's so many questions to ask within that, creating civic space. How do we get citizens involved? But maybe to think about the broader picture right now, and perhaps coming back to that if we have time. I mean, autocracies aren't going away anytime soon, unfortunately. And maybe thinking about how should democracies manage their relationships with autocracies?
Yeah, it's something I talked about in the book pretty explicitly, where I wanted to make clear that as much as my book is arguing for democracy, that democracy is a good thing, that the United States and our partners and democratic partners can't afford to say, well, we will not engage any autocracy, because there are more autocracies than there are democracies, particularly in parts of the world that are not Europe, and they're essentially not North America. When we think about Asia, I mean, of the ASEAN countries, I guess 3 of them are democracies. I do 7 autocracies, and I think about Vietnam as a very close U.S. partner. In the Middle East, of course, Saudi Arabia has been a partner. And I don't think the United States, and broadly speaking, our allies, that's United Kingdom, Germany, whatever, I don't think we need to cut off all ties with autocracies. I don't think that's wise. I think that would be kind of like shooting ourselves in the foot. But I think it's about making sure that our values are consistent with those relationships. And I think Vietnam is a good example where, certainly we would probably like it more if Vietnam was a democratic country, but that's not happening anytime soon. That the government is very strongly in power. They kind of leave it at that, but we still engage with that government and we raise human rights, I would say, slightly more delicately and more privately. And I think, honestly, engaging countries like that have a population generally friendly to the United States, even if they are not democracies, I think there is an opportunity for strong soft power efforts that go a long way. And I think the example recently was from 2014 to 2017, the U.S. ambassador to Vietnam was gay and brought his husband with 2 kids and his mother. And they lived in a 3-generation household, which is, of course, very common in Vietnam. And it played a long it would play a real role in demonstrating to the Vietnamese public that, well, oh, gay couples are just like everyone else. Like, they have kids, like, they have mothers, they all live together. And that actually helped. I mean, the studies and the data does show that Vietnamese approval ratings of LGBT rights went up. It's still a fairly conservative society, but I think there is space for things like that, even when you're engaging on autocracy. And I think probably, in my estimation, the way the Biden administration handled the Saudi relationship, I think is probably positive, where basically said, well, the assassination of a U.S. green card holding journalist is not just a normal thing we're going to move on from. We are going to we'll publicize the intelligence report on that, and we'll look to kind of somewhat, not downgrade the relationship, but keep you at arm's length for a little bit. It's almost like putting them in the penalty box. And I think the relationship now at a lower level is probably reasonably functional. It's definitely not great, but I'm okay with that. I think that's probably the right way to go about it. So the broad point here is I think every autocracy is different, where engaging Vietnam is not how we're going to engage Saudi Arabia, or engaging Vietnam is certainly not how we're going to engage China. And I think the China question that comes up a lot is, well, how would you engage China economically? I mean, it's something I've heard over and over again. I think the argument is, well, you figure out where you're going to draw the line and what goods are too sensitive to be sold to China, essentially. I'm perfectly comfortable with selling refrigerators and sneakers to Chinese consumers. I don't think there's anything even vaguely morally dubious about that. It's more so, well, what kind of semiconductor chips are dual use that can, be used for military purposes? That's kind of the broader question that will be decided country by country, but very much, Vietnam, again, I think studying Vietnam semiconductors is not a huge concern.
Yeah, I love the example you gave of soft power with the former U.S. ambassador to Vietnam. I hadn't heard that before, but that's a wonderful example. And thinking of what our future, that autocracies aren't going away anytime soon, and thinking about citizens who that trust in government, disillusionment with democracies. Maybe talking about why should citizens care? Why should citizens care about democracy working to democratic countries to prevent an authoritarian or illiberal international order from really supplanting or overwhelming our current order? What are some reasons, or how can we get citizens to be more engaged or to be interested?
Yeah, I mean, in a practical way, I think the concern is that if you have an international order, maybe it's Sino-centric, it's kind of dominated by China and China's partners, it reasons to assume that the flow of innovation will kind of go through China, which means that the West will kind of get everything second. And I think the example we're kind of waking up to at the moment on that is electric vehicles, where the electric vehicle supply chain right now very much runs through China. The critical minerals needed for electric vehicles and a whole other host of goods runs through China. Same thing for rare earths. And China has shown that the country is open to free-ish trade, is how I describe it, where there's an interest in liberal trade when it helps China, but the second someone says something that's a little bit critical of China, like Australia or Lithuania, Beijing kind of cuts off trade. And that's a fairly concerning demonstration to me of what a kind of quote-unquote Sino-centric economic order would look like, where it would require U.S. partners in the United States ourselves to basically not criticize China on X, Y, and Z for fear of losing out to our electric vehicles, or for fear of losing out the critical minerals we need. And you're seeing now the U.S. and our partners basically move to combat that by things like the CHIPS Act, things like the IRA subsidies, to basically make sure we're doing more of this production at home. That's a good first step, but I think something I tried to do in the book was to make this point more clear to citizens, where I don't think the average citizen totally understands, well, what is the problem of a Chinese-run world, or of maybe, a broadly illiberal order that with Saudi Arabia and Russia kind of sitting near the top. Well, what's the problem? And that's the problem. The problem is getting everything second. The problem is kind of getting the short end of the stick over and over again, and particularly on technology issues. And then on a broader level, of course, there is the concern that with more autocracies, you will have more international or regional orders, things like ASEAN, things like BRICS, the Arab League, operate more like the way they're operating now, or you have more institutions operate like that, where ASEAN, as we all know, has not proved itself super able to handle the Myanmar crisis. And I think, honestly, that's largely because it's mostly autocracies in the bloc, and Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand are concerned about, well, if I stand up for democracy in Myanmar, what's to stop the West from standing up for democracy in my country? It's pretty plainly self-preservational to not push for democracy so hard in Myanmar, whereas, of course, the the countries probably pushing the hardest within ASEAN are the democracies of Malaysia and Indonesia. I think you can already see now where the Arab League is entirely or almost entirely autocracy at this point, is now welcoming Syria back into the fold. BRICS, even though BRICS has, I guess, 3 democracies, is very much dominated by China and takes no positions on anything that amounts to liberal values. So that's a kind of broader concern, is as there are more autocracies, I think more orders will operate like those. And that's really dangerous to me because I think it sets the stage for more crises like Myanmar, where basically say, well, it's internal, no problem, whatever. Or basically kind of this non-interference principle that I think we're seeing a little bit from China, definitely a little bit with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, with regard to Russia and Ukraine, where basically I think more autocracies does just mean more liberalism in the international order in a way that can be really dangerous and destabilizing.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. As we're sort of not really getting close to end of our time together yet, but I wanted to make sure that you have time to talk about any points in the book that perhaps we haven't gone over yet or haven't had a chance to talk about. Is there anything in the book that you really want citizens or just, people who are interested to pay attention to, or a message you're trying to get out that you want to reinforce here?
Yeah, I think I touched on it a little bit with you earlier, but I want to say the key point here is that the economic success of today's liberal governments makes clear that certainly autocracies are not necessarily brittle. There is no guarantee that China or Saudi Arabia will eventually fall behind the West or just collapse like the Soviet Union did. And that's worth remembering too. It's worth remembering too that most of human history has been made up of empires and despots. That autocracy historically is the norm, and opposition to democracy is very much at the heart of Western civilization. Plato's Republic is an eloquent pitch for authoritarianism, for the rule of benevolent philosopher king. So I think it's important to remember that the West, or the broader West, talking about Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, we don't have a natural predisposition to democracy. It certainly is something that emanated from the West, but it's something we also have to maintain. It doesn't just, you don't just set up a democratic system that's there forever. You really do need to make sure that democracy works to keep it afloat. And I think this state of affairs should actually concern kind of small d Democrats, not the Democrats Party, but people who believe in democracy, should concern us because public legitimacy, in my mind, is conditioned on performance. Meaning that some autocracies today because some autocracies today seem to be performing better than democracies, a really distressing number of people are looking for new political visions and are finding inspiration in autocracy. So I want to make clear that there is no reason to sit and assume that the autocracies will collapse, that democracy will just win. I think betting on their dissolution, kind of as the Soviet Union dissolved, is not a wise strategy, to say the least. I would rather be on the forefront of fixing ourselves, and then maybe, when autocracy collapses and everything's easier, but I wouldn't bet on it.
Definitely. Yeah, I feel like democracy promotion is, that proverbial, like pushing the boulder up the hill forever. That sort of work. So now we are getting closer to the end of our time together. And just to wrap up our conversation with all that we've talked about and thinking of, the global state of democracy, Charles, are you optimistic about the future of democracy? And if so, can you please enlighten us and share your insights on why?
I would say I'm more optimistic than most. I think I'm more optimistic than many other democracy books have been. There are a lot of democracy books that lament the problem and say we're all kind of screwed, where I'm not really doing that. I wanted to put out a more positive vision of saying, well, how can we actually fix it? And I think I am fairly optimistic for a few reasons, where the data does show that if you live in a democracy, despite how difficult everything is, how this kind of angry, shaky era we're living through, you are more likely to live longer, you are more likely to innovate, and by my estimation, you are more likely to have a richer cultural life. And you are definitely likely to be richer, just financially richer, if you live in a democracy. Of the top 10 innovative countries, only 2 are autocracies, and that's Singapore and China. And I think it's worth remembering that we do have advantages, that as powerful as China, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, whatever it might seem, they are not yet kind of running the world. They still need Western technology. They still need the Western financial system. And that is, I think, a testament to our strength. Something I've said over and over again is what always makes me laugh is when you hear kind of maybe Saudi leaders or Chinese leaders talk about their new vision for the world order and, the new vision, their new form of order. They'll be more equal for the autocracies than ever. It always contradicts themselves when they send their children to study in the West. Their children are always going to Oxford or Harvard or Princeton. And it's a reminder to me that I think deep down, I think they probably know our system is better. And I think it's on us to make the case for that system because, frankly, if our people don't believe it, then it's not really true anymore. So I think we really need to just double down on the investments at home and double down on the reforms at home to make sure that we can basically, one, serve as a model for more countries abroad, that more countries look to us and say, well, that's the path to prosperity, not China, not Saudi Arabia. And B, can just stifle the autocratic impulse at home. I mean, if our systems work better, I do truly believe that fewer people would be open to the liberal figure that they think can come in and fix everything. So I am optimistic, but that optimistic requires some action in the short term because I think we have a little bit of a golden opportunity in the next year or few years because I think the polls do show that as much as people don't trust their governments right now, they believe in the possibility of trusting their governments. They are open to trusting their governments more. And I think we have this window, a few years, to basically make the reforms needed to capitalize on that trust and really strengthen democracy for the foreseeable future.
Definitely. We have to keep fighting. And yes, I mean, you're speaking to SIPE, whose, tagline is democracy that delivers, So thank you so much, Charles, for coming on today. This was a great conversation. I'm also at heart an optimist, and we have to keep fighting. So thank you very much for joining us again today. Thank you for this great conversation. And for our listeners who want to learn more, want to come away feeling, yes, we can do this, please check out Charles' new book, Defeating the Dictators, How Democracy Can Prevail in the Age of the Strongman. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And thank you very much, Charles. I can't wait for you to be on again.
Thanks again.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit sipe.org.